Hey, this is Torraine Walker. If you like Context Media Group, help us to keep telling stories. This is Torraine Walker from Context Media Group. Welcome to Wednesday Wisdom. Today I'm speaking with Omowale Afrika, the producer and director of UnAmerican Dilemma, a documentary about the American voting process and how it affects Black communities in the year 2020. Omowale, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
All right, let's get right into it. You opened the film with the deaths of Eric Garner, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd, interspersed with images from Robert F. Williams and Malcolm X. What was the purpose of joining those images together?
We opened the film with the execution or murder of Eric Garner. There's some imagery of Ahmaud Arbery and also George Floyd, interspersed with commentary from Robert F. Williams. And the reason why we use that commentary is because Robert F. Williams is making the argument that Black people in this country could never be considered treasonous and or traitors when we live in a country that has failed us. You know, he's making the argument that America is a failed state. So we wanted to put people in that frame of mind from the very beginning of the documentary.
All right. You made it clear that you're not a supporter of the American electoral process in the documentary. Why not?
I think that history has shown us that the American electoral process is only in place to maintain the status quo, the current power dynamics. And I think when Black people participate in a process that continually ignores, our pain and our suffering, we're almost giving an endorsement to a system that we should frankly consider illegitimate. One of the things that we were pushing for with the creation of this documentary was to in fact show that, the American electoral process, or America in and of itself, is actually illegitimate.
Why do you think America and the American voting process is illegitimate?
So to answer the first part of the question, America is illegitimate because, I would answer that question with a question, right? If a group of people was to come and conquer, kill, murder, rape one group of people, and then enslave another group of people, and then create a set of laws that essentially sanction and maintain, that criminality, at what point does that settler state become legitimate? I would argue it's never been legitimate, which is why it has to be reinforced through terrorism. It has to be reinforced through violence. It has to be reinforced through terror, because it can't be maintained without those things. So from why America is not legitimate, that's my perspective, right? The genocide of the natives of this land made America illegitimate. The enslaving of African people in this land made America illegitimate. In terms of why the voting process is not legitimate, from the very beginning of this particular country, this nation was set up to make sure that those who had power would maintain power. The vote is not, they talk about, every 4 years, there's this so-called peaceful transition of power. Well, if you know anything about history, power doesn't transition peacefully, right? I think that that's a lie or a mythology that people with power feed to powerless people to make them feel as though they have some type of say in the process, right? To make you feel good about your participation. But the reality is, when we look at the conditions in Black America, right, things have not changed by and large for our people. Now, there's been a small segment of people in Black America that have been allowed to participate, and take part in some of the benefits of this society. But by and large, right, where places where I'm from, right, where the majority of us are from, things have worsened, and that's why I would say I guess the voting process is illegitimate.
Okay. Yeah. You shot the majority of the documentary in Philadelphia. Why Philadelphia?
Well, I felt that Philly was significant because in many ways, Philly could stand in for a proxy for Black America. When you look at the situation in Philadelphia, a Black-led city, For the, at least the past 30 years, we've had Black political leadership, but also Philly being a place that is economically devastated, right? So all these things that are happening in the city, whether it be like the homelessness issue that we have, these are things that are playing out all across Black America, whether it be Atlanta, whether it be Oakland, Chicago, Baltimore. It's the same story everywhere that we are. So I felt that Philly would be a good proxy to capture that entire story.
A lot of the film takes place in Philadelphia's Black, poor and working class neighborhoods, like in barbershops, on the block and everything. What was the importance of capturing all those images and having those conversations on the block instead of in a conference room with the power structure in Philly?
Because we wanted to give voice to the voiceless, right? We wanted to show a side of things that is not typically shown in mainstream media, right? Mainstream media has one particular narrative about what's happening in Black America that is not the reality, like when you're on the ground. So we wanted to take people into the spaces. We wanted to discuss the history in real time, in a manner that captured like the significance of this moment that we were in, heading into the 2020 election. And as you know, Philadelphia played a significant, a pivotal piece, right? Because it was Biden's, I guess his win of Pennsylvania that ultimately, gained for him the presidency. And we were arguing that, you can't get the presidency in Pennsylvania without coming through Philadelphia. So it really, it all came down to how Black people in Philadelphia, voted in this particular election in terms of who was going to win, whether it would be Trump and or Biden. So it was important for people to understand the conditions of the people in a place like Philadelphia so that people could have a better understanding of why so many people in Philly did not vote. I thought that was important for folks to understand. So we wanted to take people, not in a conference room or a boardroom, but we wanted to take you right on the streets and talk to the people.
What kind of outreach did you see from the Democratic Party and the Republican Party to Black Philadelphia voters?
The operations of the Republican Party in the city weren't as wide or far-reaching, right, as the Democratic Party. But one of the things that I did see that was very interesting was you would see Donald Trump's people like handing out food like in the hood, right? So pulling up to places like Malcolm X Park in West Philly to give out, food to the community to say, hey, Donald Trump cares about you. I think things like that were actually, and speaking to people on the ground, I think those types of actions allowed some people to view Trump favorably. Things like, like the PUA, lots of people were impacted, by, the money that Trump gave as a result of the pandemic, right? So I think that those types of things led to a lot of people viewing Trump favorably in the city. In terms of the Democratic Party, like Philly is a city that has been a Democratic Party stronghold for like at least the past 70 years. So outreach is everywhere. Like you can't walk in a barbershop, like you can't turn on your TV, you can't turn on your radio without hearing from the Democratic Party if you're like in a battleground state. And I know some of my friends who, like, if you're not in a battleground state, you don't know what that's like. But like if you're in Philly leading up to an election, like the Democratic Party is everywhere. So, yeah.
What was the tone of the outreach from the Democratic Party among Black voters?
I think that the surrogates that we saw, speaking in the city, were all speaking from a sense that, this election meant everything it meant like life and death. And that was actually like the messaging that they were using, that if people didn't vote, like they would actually die, as a result of this particular election. So people approached this election as if, it was a state of emergency, right? To use a quote. And I think that they were able to galvanize a significant, section of Black Philadelphia, against, Trump, not necessarily for Biden, but against Trump. So
this election cycle has seen the conversation about tangibles become visible. The idea that Black voters are not being served for being a loyal voting bloc and their needs are being taken for granted by the Democratic Party establishment. What's interesting is that these calls for solid policy coming from black voters have been challenged not by the party, but by black academics, political pundits using language that is dismissive and condescending. Why do you think that happened?
That's actually a really good question. It goes back to the bloodbath, right, that the Democratic Party took coming out of the 60s. White people perceived that black people were the recipients of legislation, right, coming out of the 60s. And as a result, you saw this great white flight out of the Democratic Party and over to the Republican Party. So therefore, the Democrats understand that to do something that's specific for black people is toxic for the party, right? It's going to hurt the party because their, white voter base is going to feel alienated, right? You see that with Barack Obama was asked a question about, doing something specifically for black people, and his retort was that, that's not how America works. But every year every 4 years without fail, the Democratic Party comes out and says, hey, we're doing this specifically for Native Americans. We're doing this specifically for LGBT. We're doing this specifically for women. But they will never say they're doing anything specifically for black people, right? Kamala Harris, right? She comes out, I'm not going to do anything specifically for black people. They understand that to do something specifically for black people is to alienate their white voter base. So black people are in a conundrum. Black people continually give their loyalty to the Democratic Party, right? Because they don't have really anywhere else to go in a two-party system. So we consistently vote for a party that can't do anything specifically for us because the party can't win with us, if that makes sense. It can only win by ignoring us.
And just if you can touch on a little bit more about the vehemence and the condescension that black academics and political pundits and newscasters had against, poor and working class black people who demanded tangibles.
Yeah.
I mean, you saw it. I mean, it was vehement. A lot of that stuff sounded like the alt-right.
Yeah. It absolutely did sound very alt-rightist or white supremacist. And I think what occurred is with the election of Barack Obama back in 2008, a significant amount of black people saw themselves as fully American. You hear it in our language today when we talk about the election process. We're like, our Constitution, our courts, our judges, our president, our country. Like Malcolm said, I'm not a Republican or a Democrat. I'm not an American and got sense enough to know it. So when he hear people talk about the plantation, that's what I hear when I hear them say, our country. I hear we sick. Right. So with that divide in the black community, over the past 12 years, it's only grown to the point where we're at in 2020, where I think that divide is probably the widest that it's ever been. So that exchange that you see happening where you have the masses of black people are discontent, but you have this group of black people who feels as though, no, things are actually getting better because things are getting better for them. That's where you get like the argument and like the conflict, because this group cannot survive without this group voting. In the documentary, I refer to that as political sharecropping. I say that the black elite own the land, but the black masses pick the cotton. So the black masses need to get out there and vote, or the black elite cannot sustain their comfort in their political gains in this country.
Why is the response from that group that you mentioned been so vicious and so hostile?
I think that over the past 12 years, right, the black community probably has grown more divided since the election of Barack Obama. Like with the election of Barack Obama, there were a significant amount of black people who felt as though they were now American, right? And you hear that like in the language now. When people are talking about the elections and about the United States, they say things like our country, our courts, our Constitution, our judges, our president. It's like the whole Malcolm X, like we sick. Like you hear more and more of that from people who became Negro American patriots following the election of Barack Obama. So in 2020, you have that group on this side, and then you have the rest of us on the other side. And I think that the gap between these two groups or the chasm in Black America is so wide. And the thing that I was arguing in the documentary is that in 2020, that division is probably the widest that it's ever been in our political history. So as a result of that, with so many young people saying that they were not going to vote, and that they were going to sit out the election if Biden couldn't offer any tangible benefits to the Black community, it created this fiery situation where you have this exchange between hardcore Democratic Party loyalists and non-for-profit people who benefit from the white ally industrial complex that are now attacking the Black community because the Black community refuses to get in line behind the Democratic Party.
In the last 4 years, the idea of representation has dominated social and political discourse. Do you think that the obsession with this idea has helped or hurt poor and working class Black communities?
I think that this obsession with Black representation has significantly devastated, our community, like when it comes to politics. This idea that having a Black face in a position of power represents some type of progress and or advancement for the masses of Black people has been a tool that the white power structure has used against us for the greater part of a century. This kind of like token representation, like we can point to this one person or this individual, and somehow that person being in position should represent that the group is doing well by way of that person being in position. No, that's not the way that things work, right? If we don't get tangible policy that can impact our material conditions, then it doesn't matter if you have a Black president. Doesn't matter if you have a Black vice president. You can have a Black secretary of state. You can have a Black secretary general. You can have a Black chief of the CIA. Like whatever positions you want to have. And I think that's why again I use Philly as a proxy for all of Black America, right? Because over the past 40 years, Philly has been a city that you talk about Black representation. Everything has been Black. The mayor has been Black. The chief of police have been Black. The fire chief has been Black. All of the city council members, they're all Black. But this is in a city where the murder rate is skyrocketing. This is a city where those Black representatives are colluding with white developers to push Black people out of the city. So like homelessness, poverty, like all these things under Black, leadership or so-called Black representation. So I think that in and of itself can tell the story that Black representation is not actual indicative of progress and or change for Black people.
The concept of Black progress has historically been a multifaceted one, culturally, economically, politically. Do you feel like the idea of Black progress has been shrunken down into electoral politics at the expense of everything else?
I think that our full movement as Black people in this country has been shrunken down into electoral politics since the 60s. Basically, prior to us, getting the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, all of the legislation that came out of the 60s, like Black people had built and sustained, organizations that allowed them to apply pressure to this system for true, progress, whether it was, defeating, Jim Crow or, ending segregation or whatever it was that the goal was at that particular time. After, essentially we achieved integration, our movement, we as Black people in this country has just become independent of the Democratic Party, right? I think it was Glenn Ford from Black Agenda Report. He did an interview a few years ago where he stated that every 4 years, every institution in the Black community just becomes an auxiliary unit of the Democratic Party, right? So the Black church, the Black, Greek letter organizations, all work in tandem every 4 years just to get the vote out, because the vote becomes the means by which, the so-called progress is maintained. So yes, our entire movement has been kind of like shrunken or truncated, and now it's housed in the Democratic Party.
You explore the history of integration versus separation in the documentary, starting with General Sherman's Field Order 15 right after the Civil War. Why did you feel it was important to include that backstory in the documentary?
I wanted to show that historically there's been this parallel movement within Black America, and not all of our aims and objectives have been the same, right? To be quite frank, it was important to show how that first generation of people who were enslaved in the South, that their desire, right, was to live separately, right? They did not want to be integrated. They wanted their own land, and they did not want to live, intermixed, so to speak, with white people. Whereas though a lot of the free black people who were in the North, often who were of mixed race, ancestry, so they had their fathers may have been slave masters and their, mothers may have been enslaved. Those folks did want to live, intermixed with white people. They didn't see a notion of freedom where they would live separate from white folks. And I wanted to show that that group has been the de facto imposed leadership of Black America since then, right? So I was essentially making the argument that they have been misleading us based on their own, selfish agenda and or aspirations that have not always been aligned with the group. So,
what do you feel are some solutions to correct some of the issues you address in UnAmerican Dilemma?
So, UnAmerican Dilemma is really meant to serve as a organizing tool, right, or as a piece of propaganda to help people advance their level of political education. I don't think that any significant change or transformation can be made for Black people until we reach the conclusion that this society, right, this voting process, the electoral process, is illegitimate. I think that once you reach that particular conclusion, then it opens you up to other activity that you can engage in, whether it be organizing, politicizing you to a higher level to truly make some changes in society. And I think that that work is going to take place like really at the grassroots. We have to get ourselves more organized than what we have been. I try to be fair to us because it's very difficult for us, in the Black community to compete against the amount of resources that the Democratic Party has. So I don't think that we are necessarily out-organized, by the Democratic Party. I just think that they control all the resources. So it's very easy for them to come into the community and mobilize the community, just overnight. I think that we have to get better at doing more with less, but I don't think that we get there until we all, or a critical mass of us reach that conclusion that Du Bois reached in 1956 when he said, "I won't vote." Once a critical mass of Black people reach that conclusion, I think we will reach the next level, in our maturation politically in terms of how we should be engaging if we are going to leave, the vote to the side. So,
what do you want people to take away from the documentary?
The documentary was meant to be like an alarm bell, kind of like whistleblowing, like, hey, there's this crisis that is right around the corner for Black America. We see parts of it today, right, with like the forced migration, like a lot of us being pushed out of our community, the economic devastation, the starvation that's happening in our community. Like, we can see that. But what's coming down the road is going to be significantly worse. And the political institutions as they are currently constructed in society are not able to address the crisis that's coming to your community, right? So that's what this documentary, what I was attempting to do with this particular project. Because if Black people understood the significance of what things are going to be like for us in this country in another 5 to 10 years, then we would stop wasting our time with the vote, as a tool by which we get change, and we would look to gain change in other, means or avenues that the vote will not provide for us.
Omowale Afrika, producer and director of UnAmerican Dilemma documentary. It's available on Vimeo. Thank you for your time.